the process, we had to introduce them to concepts like a public hotspot. Problems like, oh, a single HTTP session, what does it mean? That can be 100 connections for one site. If you just view one page, that can be any number of individual connections. They weren't aware of that. It's unexpected. One would think that at least the major agencies like the Bundeskriminalamt or the Home Office in the UK and so would be aware how this type of communication works. They aren't. The demands are still there. And even the EU Justice Department and even DG Info, which normally is quite aware of what is going on, were not aware of self-organized voice-over-IP networks, or they didn't consider citywide free access zones for a waveLAN or something like that. Very strange. These are realities today, realities which will not map into data retention. Another problem is that a user might not even be aware of the communication. As a provider, we have thousands of connections which the users are not aware of. Background processes, spam, backdoors, whatever, attacks. It's a huge part of the connections in the network today, and none of the users concerned initiated these. How does that relate to data retention? Is it an active process? Still, everyone is under scrutiny here, and will be part of the investigation if his IP address pops up somewhere. I find it highly questionable that there is no clear case which can be demonstrated. How can law enforcement, which is supposed to uphold the law, at least I thought that's what it is, can avoid every discussion and stop discussion? Whenever they lost a discussion or an argument somewhere, someone just stand up and said, well, do you want to be responsible when the next bomb explodes? Techies kind of say, well, but we're not responsible. But with politicians, that doesn't work. That's the moment. Wherever the discussion stands at that point, it's stopped dead in its tracks. Politicians will just be shocked at that point and say, oh no, we don't want to be responsible. So okay, let's have data retention because we don't want to be responsible. That's kind of like the argument goes. And from my experience, it is very hard to go against interior home office ministries. Their arguments are never, they're emotional, they're not factually based. What happened in December is basically blackmailing the Commission by the threat of a council decision by the end of the year. Even so, they knew that the third pillar instrument would not be legal in the EU legal framework. The council threatened to still adopt a framework decision. Argument being, well, then we have it, and it's years before it's overturned in the EU courts. Is that something which you would expect from governments? I certainly didn't, but I was faced with it early December. The normal Commission consultation process, normally the Commission has consultation with industry, with individuals. Every individual can send in his concerns. There is a whole process. It didn't happen. It was simply stopped dead. And as I said before, many of the governments who supported this, who wanted this, cannot get it through in their own parliaments and in their own national legislation. What does it mean for industry? That is not so important for the private individuals maybe, but it's a paradigm shift. So far we were told to store as little as we can. Now we're told to store as much as we can. That overturns the internal processes quite a bit. And even worse, the cost is very different depending on the country you're in. In Austria, for example, you get full cost reimbursement. In Germany, you get zero cost reimbursement. This is not really compatible with a Commission directive and will be a separate court case. It's already clear that large telcos like KPN, for example, will file against this. We need new procedures. So far we were told we're not allowed to correlate usage data with administrative data. Now we need to do this right up front before we store it. We were prohibited to do that in the past. Those new procedures are always very difficult and very expensive to implement. And the whole measure requires, that's part of the measure, it requires secure, reliable storage systems with backup, with access protection and everything. That is not standard for logging data today. We have one thing in legal interception today, which is called undue delays. That means when there is an order to tap a line, it needs to be implemented within hours. The same undue delays we now find in the text for releasing data from the data retention proposal. Basically, it means that we need to dedicate personnel, which is also quite expensive. On the acquisition side, I have to say it is now at least doable. It wasn't before. It still means that we need to get data of various sorts of devices, routers, hosts, administrative systems, and process it and put it into one system, which is then secured and access only granted on a court order. But a lot of this was never systematically retrieved so far. So it will put heavy impact on the systems, on the switches, on the routers. That also means that significant system upgrades are required, which are again expensive. This motivates why cost was such a big discussion issue in the whole process. It's a sad fact that human rights were the minor discussion point. Cost was the major discussion point throughout the whole 2 years. It also requires new investments in phased out technology, which is being phased out right now, especially the SDH and SS7 switches, which are in use by the big telcos today. KPN estimates that they need to place an additional switch next to every switch they have today. Basically, they would have to double their investment into a technology which they're phasing out within the next 3 years. It might speed up voice over IP developments. That's a positive side. But I'm not really sure if that really is a good driver for data retention. Also, obviously, law enforcement thinks about or along the lines of traditional telephone calls. Whenever you talk to them about the number of calls they want to look at or what they think their systems need to handle, the numbers which pop up are clearly related to the traditional telephony. Obviously, we all know that the number of sessions which happen in data networks are several factors higher, that just setting up a telephone call in the internet is effectively several independent sessions. So there will be several orders of magnitude more connections to be logged. Which leads us to the processing. All this needs to be processed on the ISP side. So far, we are not really sure what we need to process because there's no definition for the data types. We don't have any data structures. Nothing has been done so far on this. Still, we know that, for example, the only effective way to store this is to pre-process it and then store it, because you cannot post-process it properly. It will never lead to a good result. Interestingly enough, cost reimbursement, at least like it works in Germany, would mean that you got only reimbursed for post-processing, which leads us to an interesting situation. Do I pre-process or post-process? I would tend to post-processing because I don't care about the quality of the data. Is this all sane? Probably not. Even if we pre-process the data, even if we take all the cost, one single provider would still never be able to give you a good view. Law enforcement needs to be able to correlate data from multiple sources two providers, typically some email service provider, some other sources if it has multiple protocols. So it doesn't really help you to, if you find one provider, it's still a lot of detail work to actually get even a single session together. On other things like voice over IP, we have no idea how to store it. Yes, if you look at a special setup, like it's used by some large telcos, you might be able to store it. Strangely enough, this is the view most regulators take today on voice over IP networks. The concept they have is that of networks like the one implemented by T-Online now, like AOL, where the whole voice cloud is under the control of one provider. If it's cross-boundary, there is no concept. Other things like the requirement to store BCCs of emails. Service providers currently have no idea how to do it. The whole concept of a BCC tells me I don't know about it. So how would I store this? Other things are okay, and we could provide it from the systems today already, which is the IP to user mapping, which is a very, very valid concern also for other legal cases. Fraud on the internet, something like that. If you don't have IP to user mappings, you won't be able to deliver on this. Which brings me to the point of avoidance. The proposal as it is today, from my point of view as a techie, is completely senseless. If you use an email server outside of the EU, nothing gets logged. If you use a zip server outside the EU, nothing gets logged. And you also won't catch the actual voice stream because you don't know about the stream. If you use the non-standard ports, it won't get logged because you're not looking at this. If you run your own service of broadband connections, for example, you're not part of the group which needs to store data. Only public service providers need to store data. So if you run your own service, you're out. If you only use public lookup services, same thing. The individual call which needs to be logged is not part of it. The DNS or enum lookup is not part of what needs to be stored. And then the actual call setup is not done by a service provider. It's easily avoided. Also, there's an exception for internet cafes, public hotspots, and foreign SIM cards. Nothing gets logged, or at least it might get logged, but we don't know who the one who actually did the communication was, so it's useless information. In Germany, just to look at this, probably our constitutional court will overturn it as well. That is looking at the last decisions regarding wiretapping. So far, we still have a standing resolution of the Parliament that they don't want data retention. We don't know how the new coalition will look at this once it's brought to vote, but that is the situation right now. Schäuble thinks that it's the Staatsbürgerpflicht of the industry to actually fully take over the cost. In the end, it doesn't really matter because either if the state bears the cost or is done through industry, in the end users will pay. It is significant cost. Even now today. It is still, I have to say, through the whole process, we were able to cut down estimated cost by at least, well, I'd say it's a 50th of the original cost. If the original proposal from April 2004 would have come to bear, it would have been really very, very expensive, and we believe that communication would have raised the price at least 50%. But honestly, in Germany, it's too early to tell right now. Mr. Ulrich from the BMWR will have to come up with his proposals on how to implement this. And so far, he hasn't. That will probably happen in Q2. Okay, my conclusions on this. Only uninformed individuals will be detected. I'm not sure if terrorists are uninformed individuals. I believe they know very well what they're doing. So once we have data retention implemented, I'm pretty sure they know how to avoid it. and looking at their structures, they'll probably use servers outside of the EU.